People of YouTube, I have returned. This is going to be the third offshoot video I've made, in deviating from what I've planned in the pipeline, but I wouldn't have had to if the occasion was of actual importance. My first deviance was in response to Birdie Wing getting panned by radical Yuri enthusiasts for daring to tell an actual good story as opposed to caving into lesbianic depravity. The second deviance was me giving 4 reasons why Godzilla -1 was on track to outdoing the original 1954 Gojira. So today in this video, we are going to be doing a movie analysis of the recently released 2023 film Godzilla -1. I just saw this movie a couple of times at my local theaters, and the more I reflect upon what I saw, I realize that I have witnessed one of the best Godzilla movies ever made, if not the best Godzilla movie ever made.
Shut up. Godzilla 1954 is the best Godzilla movie ever made because it was the first Godzilla movie to ever be made. Go live in hell with the other bad people.
Yes, Godzilla -1 this year is on par with Christopher Nolan's Oppenheimer, including but not limited to Cocaine Bear, Pixar's Elementals, My Big Fat Greek Wedding Part 3, The Hunger Games prequel The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes, Ridley Scott's Napoleon with Walking Phoenix, and the only good film Pureflix made known as Sound of Freedom. Those were the only films I looked forward to seeing this year, as mostly everything else like Barbie was just hot garbage. But I'm digressing. All in all, Godzilla -1 has officially surpassed the original Gojira by a landslide, and it has definitely blasted the red-headed Evangelion wannabe stepchild and so-called spiritual successor to Gojira known as Shin Godzilla right out of the water. So, allow me to explain why, unlike Zack Snyder's Batman v Superman, Takashi Yamazaki's Godzilla -1 is a modern masterpiece. Since just about every video essay about a Godzilla movie does a recapitulation to explain the context and metatext surrounding the movie, usually to knock down previous IPs, to raise up the new one, this recap is going to explain something similar in how we got to this point in time. There are among us Godzilla fans people who have retroactively put movies from certain eras into all their rightful continuities. So for instance, Godzilla 1984 is technically a Showa era movie, but we consider it part of the Heisei canon continuity, because no one in their right mind would think 1984 is a direct sequel to Terror of Mechagodzilla. Godzilla turning into an existential threat to Japan, after he saved Japan from Titanosaurus and Mechagodzilla, would be utterly stupid. And the Millennium movies are all Heisei era movies, but we call it the Millennium series, because 5 out of 6 of them are technically soft reboots. However, history would show you that the Millennium era would have never happened if not for TriStar's Godzilla in 1998, and then history repeated itself when Toho brought the true Godzilla quote-unquote out of hibernation in response to a mainstream Hollywood version in 2014. But here's where things are different. In a pre-2014 world, fans easily dismissed the only American Godzilla movie at the time because it bombed. Even though fans and critics shat on it, it made enough money to be the highest grossing film of '98, just underneath Armageddon and Saving Private Ryan. Now, in a post-2014 world, no matter what side of the fence you're on, Gareth Edwards' Godzilla was met with high praise from critics and the general public, and raked in hundreds of millions. But most significant of all, it caused a schism between fans, who were open to Godzilla becoming mainstream, and believed that he finally got respected in the West, and fans who felt the cultural identity and the heart of Godzilla were in danger of being lost. How many people have you heard say,
Godzilla 2014 was a good film, but not a good Godzilla film? Sure, Gareth Edwards' Godzilla was considered to be a good film, but also a relatively safe one.
This version happens to be an A-level treatment of a very standard B-level monster movie, so this film is just basically so far away from being ready to discuss such sophisticated topics and deal with them that it's not worth mentioning.
CGI. Come on, stick to original guy in the rubber suit, don't give us this crap.
This is where Toho purism comes from. So in the wake of 2014's critical and box office success, these purists adopted James Rolfe's champagne analogy as a rationalization coping defense mechanism, but more so to put their creed into words so as to reassure themselves as the true Godzilla fans quote-unquote. Basically, Toho purism is traditionalistic. The strangest part in all of this is that when any piece of Reiwa Godzilla content comes under fire, it's the Toho Purists who defend it as being experimental and project the label traditionalist onto the critic. Their defenses amount to Toho is loyally taking risks to get the series back on its feet again after running it into the ground by sticking so hard to formula with the last few eras. But how can all of this be true? The past Reiwa content has recycled the sound effects and music of films long ago, and since Shin Godzilla was so undeservingly popular, it perfected a formula for the anime trilogy and most notably Singular Point. What Toho has done in recent years is no different than what Disney has done with their live-action remakes. If James Rolfe had any shred of honesty, he would point out that Toho has been doing the same fucking thing over and over again, but he won't, because that would require him to admit that his sacred cow is flawed. In addition, Godzilla has been portrayed differently in each content. Doesn't that contradict the Toho purist belief that Godzilla needs to be an actor in a rubber suit? Even James Rolfe had to eat his own words with that one.
On one hand, I feel really sad to know that when a Godzilla movie isn't using a person in a suit, then the era has totally died.
And that didn't age well, did it? So the Reiwa content thus far isn't experimental, neither is it traditional. But overall, the storytelling in each has just been terrible, as these are bare-bones stories with a severe lack of attention to detail, representing some of the blandest, shittiest Japanese fantasy and science fiction material in the darkest time of the franchise's history these past years, in both content and execution, full of shitty clones and inferior suck-ass takes on older ideas and characters. Shin Godzilla is supposedly based on the 3/11 Fukushima disaster, yet it disregards humanity figuratively and literally. More so than the Japanese government did to its own people. The anime trilogy fails to be a story on all four pillars of storytelling, those being plot, characters, world building and themes. And Singular Point manipulates its audience into believing it has even a modicum of intelligence when stacked up against a movie about a monkey punching a lizard on an aircraft carrier in the middle of the ocean. My best hope is people will come around, and they certainly have with the anime trilogy, and thankfully they are starting to pierce through Shin Godzilla's glamour, noticing the flaws in their supposed diamond in the rough, when they didn't at first. It's only a matter of time before they start burning Singular Point to the ground, and once they do, they'll come to realize that Reiwa sycophants and shills like Blue Nova have been trying to pull the wool over their eyes, convincing them that it was great content with every conscious effort. So now we come to where Godzilla -1 fits in all of this. As of November 3rd, the film has received universal acclaim from Japanese audiences. Even Americans that traveled to Japan have given similar praise, like D-Man 1954 of all people, and it got 100% critics score on Rotten Tomatoes of all places. About Rotten Tomatoes though, two things. One is the only other Godzilla movie on Rotten Tomatoes that's gotten 100 was Godzilla vs. Destroyer, and obviously that movie isn't good enough to warrant a 100% rating. And two is, if you're praising -1's Rotten Tomatoes score, when you've called them unreliable, after said site gave a low score to Say King of the Monsters back in 2019, you're a blatant hypocrite. Anyways, -1 has been highly praised for supposedly returning Godzilla back to his original Japanese roots, which is what they said about Shin Godzilla back in the 2016. However, -1 has done several things that seem to have not been noticed by the vast majority. It forgoes being experimental or tradition, and returns to basically telling a story. It has its share of new ideas we haven't seen before, while taking concepts and ideas from past Godzilla movies, be it TriStar, Legendary, and Toho, and integrates them into a script that is functional on its own, and therefore has meaning. It even shows that lessons have been learned from the shortcomings of the previous Godzilla movies, be they gaping plot holes, sloppily written characters and whatnot. Concept-wise, the film is a remake of the original 1954 movie that Tomoaki Tanaka wanted to do back in 1977, but it's also a remake of the direct Showa sequel Raids Again. But overall -1 is much more than a remake of those two films. Throughout this video, I'll be pointing out the ideas and concepts used and where they came from, and which shortcomings from films past have been improved upon in this film. From this point on, there will be spoilers, you have been warned. Once upon a time in the last days of World War II, a kamikaze pilot named Koichi Shikishima receives a suicide mission as a last-ditch effort against Allied forces. But during flight, he's afraid to come through with his sortie, because it'll mean his death, so he lies about mechanical issues with his plane and lands on the military base on Odo Island, where a bunch of mechanics are. At night, a loud roar awakens everyone, and it's a pre-nuke Godzilla called Gojira standing at 15 meters sporting a different design than the one we've seen in the trailers. This was the other toy figure known as Monster B that we heard about from the leaks, which said there were going to be two Godzillas akin to War of the Gargantuas, but still notably Godzilla. There is a neat setup to Godzilla's arrival throughout where deep sea fish pop up in the water dead. Kind of like what happened to the lot of fish in KOTM. So the dinosaur starts trashing the base and killing the mechanics, even biting one like the T-Rex bit the lawyer off the toilet in Jurassic Park. The lead mechanic, Tachibana, tells Koichi to climb into a plane and shoot the dinosaur. He gets in the cockpit, but he is frozen into inaction by fear. By the end of the rampage, everyone except Koichi and Tachibana are killed. So this is overall a great setup for our protagonist Koichi. His character flaw is that of fear, which results in hindrance. He hindered in his kamikaze mission out of the fear of dying, and here he hindered in the face of Gojira. And because of his hindrance, and him surviving on top of that, he develops kind of a death wish, or belief that he doesn't deserve to be alive, because of his failure to save them. The film then covers Koichi's life returning to Tokyo, after it's been carpet bombed by the Allied forces and Japan has no choice but to surrender. World War II is officially over, but Japan is left devastated, and its morale is reduced to zero. Koichi sees that his house has been reduced to rubble. He learns from Sumiko Ota, who lives next door to him, that his parents died in an air raid, and that her children died too. She also knows that Koichi was enlisted as a kamikaze pilot, and seeing that he's still alive calls him a disgrace and a piece of shit. However, Koichi meets a woman named Noriko, who is an optimistic and resilient woman living alone in the burned out ruins along with a baby she had adopted, because its parents died in the Tokyo firebombing. The two bond over their shared experiences in losing their loved ones, and create a makeshift family to look after Akiko. To support said family, Koichi starts up work in a mine removal ship with three other characters: Kenji Noda, a scientist with glasses, Shiro Mizushima, a rowdy young man, and Yoji Akitsu, the captain of the Shinsei Maru. Meanwhile, Godzilla gets mutated by the Operation Crossroads nuclear test in Bikini Atoll, and he sinks a bunch of US ships in revenge, while making a beeline for Tokyo. Through a stock footage montage, General Douglas MacArthur and the US forces send a message to Japan saying there's a large aquatic organism coming towards you, but we can't help, because of tensions with the USSR. You're pretty much on your own. So our protagonists in their small ship are tasked with delaying Godzilla long enough for the Japanese dreadnought crew's attack how to get there, and prevent Godzilla from reaching Japan. There's a chase scene with Godzilla swimming after their boat that pays homage to Jaws with all of the thrills and spills. They drop a mine into Godzilla's mouth and detonate it, blowing open a chunk of his mouth like what happened in Jaws 2, but Godzilla immediately regenerates his mouth, which is a new take on an aspect which I'll get to later on. The Takao shows up just in time to save them, but it gets destroyed rather quickly by Godzilla with everyone aboard dying. Godzilla jumps onto the Takao and punches it, but he gets knocked off by its certain naval railguns. Godzilla then shoots a beam from below to destroy it, like he did in Godzilla vs. Kong. This is the first time we see the beam, but don't see the charge up, since he is underwater. The ship explodes instantly, which is the shot we saw in a trailer, and Godzilla roars triumphantly and swims away. Koichi and his crew get back to Tokyo, but they can't tell everyone that Godzilla's coming by order of the Japanese government. However, Koichi explains to Noriko that he had a previous encounter with Godzilla, and this is where he also tells her about the guilt he's having over the people who died while he lived. There's a few moments where he has a breakdown and is questioning whether he actually survived the war or whether this is just a dream he's having as a dying man. That's some pretty deep interesting stuff right here. Perhaps the most deep this franchise has ever delved into. Godzilla then arrives in Japan, attacking Ginza in Tokyo, which is where Noriko is working. She's on a train when he notices it at his feet. He bites down onto the train car, recreating the train scene from the original 1954 movie, which is something I've always wanted to see improved upon. Noriko manages to jump off the train, but her strong will is shattered seeing Tokyo getting demolished once again. But Koichi arrives after hearing Godzilla heading towards Ginza on the radio to save her and get her moving. The Japanese military attacks Godzilla, which leads to Godzilla using his beam. It's quite powerful. It's the huge explosion we see in the trailer, and leaves a giant mushroom cloud much like the one in GMK. Godzilla's beam has a cool charge up we saw a bit of from one of the trailers where the spines glow blue and push out of his body, moving from the tip of his tail up the body, then they all pop back in at once as he fires. Godzilla looks charred as his beam kind of burns him. He can't fire it for a while after he uses it. Noriko pushes Koichi into an alley, and even though the beam impacts isn't far off, basically everything is obliterated. Koichi comes out, and there's no one else alive around. Noriko has apparently been killed, leaving Koichi wanting to get back at Godzilla, much like Haruo in the anime trilogy, only 100 times better. Kenji lets Koichi in on a plan he's hatched to kill Godzilla, but since no one in the Japanese government wants to take responsibility for this, it's basically up to an organization of civilians who are mostly naval veterans organized by Hotta Tatsuo, in order to save Japan from destruction. In case you were wondering about the political stance this movie has, there is a scene where Kenji explains all the ways a state Shinto Japanese empire sucked at caring for its people, which makes sense, since they were indoctrinated to believe kamikazing themselves into enemy ships was honorable. Kenji therefore makes a strong statement that this is not a fight to the death, this is a fight for future lives. Great writing, all around. The ragtag Godzilla fighters managed to get one plane, a fighter that was newly developed just before the war ended, but it's in bad shape. Koichi gets the old mechanic, Tachibana, from Odo Island to help fix it, but this guy hates Koichi due to him freezing up on Odo Island during Godzilla's first attack. Tachibana beats the shit out of Koichi more so than Serizawa beat up Ogata in the first movie, but Koichi manages to convince Tachibana to help with his plan to finish his war by suicide bombing himself into Godzilla's mouth, due to Godzilla basically being immune to conventional weapons from the outside, but is more vulnerable from the inside. You can see here the tension between what scientist Kenji said and the goals of this plan and Koichi's death wish. However, Tachibana makes one modification to Koichi's plane. The plan to kill Godzilla is to rapidly sink him down to 1500 meters with chlorofluorocarbon gas bubbles.
Fucking bubbles!
Hoping that the pressure at the bottom will crush him like a green snake under a sugarcane truck. And if that doesn't work, balloons made by a Japanese balloon company will inflate around his waistline to rapidly raise him to the surface and kill him via explosive decompression. Sounds a bit odd, but it flows pretty well. Operation Sea God commences. Koichi lures Godzilla into a body of water, where he's directly below a trench. They do sink Godzilla, but that doesn't kill him. They activate the balloons, but Godzilla tears through after only being raised up to about 800 meters. They have their two ships try to pull him up from there, but the ships don't have enough horsepower until a small fleet of tugboats led by Mizushima arrive to help. They get him up to the surface and he's injured, seemingly frozen like a statue and eyes bulging out of his head, but it's not enough to kill him. Once recovered, Godzilla is pissed off. Right before firing an atomic blast to kill everyone, Koichi flies the plane into Godzilla's mouth, blowing his head off like Britney Spears in that South Park episode. Godzilla's body is then disintegrated by the overload of atomic energy, pretty much like in GMK. But then we see that Koichi is still alive, and there's a moment where everyone observing salutes. There's a quick flashback to Tachibana showing Koichi he's installed an ejection feature to the plane, and convinces him to continue living for Akiko's sake. Wonderful. When we get back to port, Koichi receives a telegram and rushes off to a hospital, where we find out that Noriko actually survived. They have a heartfelt reunion where she asks him, "Is your war over yet?" only for us the audience to see that she's got something on the back of her neck. This may be radiation poisoning. Who knows? Right before the end credits, we see a piece of Godzilla sinking to the bottom of the ocean, starting to regenerate. Just like Godzilla's heart kept pumping like in GMK. Finn. And that is Godzilla -1, and what an incredible fucking film it is. Now the question is, why does it work? It's the same reason Neon Genesis Evangelion, Godzilla against Mechagodzilla, and GMK work, the human characters. Yes, they do matter. -1 has the best character work I've seen in a Godzilla film in recent years. The cast is so well defined that -1 can be adapted into a visual novel on a PlayStation like 428 Shibuya Scramble, and it would still work. And anyone with the gall to say these characters are poorly characterized is just being stupid.
And this character, I have the name in front of me and I'm still going to butcher it, Koichi Shikishima. He is miserable. I don't like this character. He's constantly chips are down. He's constantly like making bad decisions, or sometimes they're actually good decisions, but he thinks they're bad. It's just not a pleasant character to watch. And his arc is so cliche and predictable that it's just like, what are we doing here? This is the best we could conjure up.
The problem is that despite all the interesting risks it takes, Godzilla -1 still collides head-on with the most hoary of Godzilla stumbling blocks. Poor characterization of human leads, and tragically just not enough of the king of monsters himself.
Uh-oh! Retard alert! Retard alert!
As you may have figured from the chronological retelling, Koichi Shikishima's story is that of the hero's journey, and if I had to take a wild guess, I would say that Yamazaki must have watched Jordan Peterson's lectures or read his books about this archetype and storytelling. Even though Koichi started out chickening out of his Kamekozi mission, and out of the opportunity to shoot Godzilla on Odo Island, that's not really the start of his journey. The hero's journey usually begins in the ordinary world, which is when Koichi is rebuilding his life after the war, while he is haunted by his past failures to the point where he has nightmares about them like Kratos did in the old God of War games. Only in -1 does Koichi at several points think that he's been living in a dead man's dream. His character arc begins when he crosses the threshold from the ordinary to the extraordinary. It's when Koichi sees Godzilla again out in the middle of the ocean, which is the archetypical dragon of chaos that Dr. Jordan Peterson would tell you. Back to the story, Koichi recoils in fear, however, Yoji, the man he has worked with for years, snaps him out of his fear to muster up enough courage to shoot the mine in Godzilla's mouth so they can all get out of there. Later on, unfortunately, just when he's ready to move on with his life, Noriko is presumed dead after Godzilla's attack on Ginza, which plunges Koichi much deeper into despair. This is the abyss. The negative state that this film is named for. But there is an atonement. Other than Kenji proposing a plan to defeat Godzilla, Tachibana accepts Koichi's plea to fix up his jet, and tells him to finish the mission as chickened out of before, and win his war. Now atoned, Koichi delivers the ultimate blow that defeats Godzilla, his war is over, and returns to a renewed sense of normalcy. And seeing Noriko alive, he deserves his overwhelmingly sweet ending. Aside from that character arc, there are aspects to Koichi that make him multi-dimensional. He forms camaraderie with his cowhawkers, much like the characters in Godzilla Raids Again were average Joes trying to make a living in post-war Japan, and became comrades in arms against Godzilla. There are even moments where he invites them in his home for dinner, and help him raise Akiko. From his conversations with Noriko, he describes his dilemma as his war, even though World War II is officially over. And because he confided that part of himself to Noriko, she helps him get through his vulnerability. This goes to show that men are not just monolithic unstoppable titans as someone like Kathy Newman would have you believe. Men are capable of feeling emotions. By the resolution of his character arc, Koichi takes flight and proves to be one hell of a pilot like Poe Dameron. The scene where he gets Godzilla's attention and lures him back to the sea is honestly my favorite part of the movie. So overall, I would consider Koichi to be the central character of the story, the one wherein the other characters affect him over the course of it. The character that comes to my mind the quickest for comparing Koichi to on a conceptual level here is Akane Yashiro. Both characters are similar. They started out showing hesitation in the face of Godzilla, and it led to the death of their comrades. As a result, they live with the survivor's guilt. The difference between them is their internal struggle. Akane kept to herself most of the time, and saw herself as worthless, but after working to redeem herself, and being reminded that her life has value from a child's perspective, her self-esteem improved. She and Kiryu defeated Godzilla, but Akane let Godzilla live, because she believed that even Godzilla's life had value as much as Kiryu's. Meanwhile Koichi is rebuilding his life in a post-World War II Japan, yet his internal struggle is having nightmares of his encounter with Godzilla, and believing that his war is not over. Yet his resolution is to carry out the Kamikaze mission he bailed out on years ago, only this time, he has the option to eject himself, because they were denied that option during the war. Now I think, no matter what side of the fence you're on, whether you like or dislike the anime trilogy a lot, it seems like everyone can kind of agree that Haruo Sakaki is the most uninteresting piece of shit protagonist. And in my point of view, Koichi is a vast improvement. Koichi and Haruo are similar in wanting revenge on Godzilla, Koichi believing Noriko was killed by Godzilla's blast and Haruo being just Haruo. The difference is obviously that Koichi has a lot more substance to his character in just one movie than Haruo ever did in his 3 movies. Another difference is their reason to fight. Haruo wants to kill Godzilla for supposedly embarrassing humanity into living in harsh conditions in the void of space, even though everyone on the ship should be angry at the captain's decision not to install hypersleep and light speed travel, so they wouldn't bore themselves to death over the span of 20 years to wherever the fuck they were going. Koichi wants to get rid of Godzilla because he wants to fight for the future lives of Japan and to confront the living embodiment of his internal struggles and put them to bed. And finally, Haruo Kamikazed himself into Godzilla when there was no logic or reason to do so, and he's worshipped as a god later on, so it comes off as poetically fucking retarded. But Koichi has no reason to kill himself. He's got a little girl waiting for him back home, and so he carries out his Kamikaze mission and ejects at the last second so he can live while delivering the final blow to Godzilla for the time being. Fantastic. Now that I think about it, it's almost like Yamazaki is giving Hiroyuki Seshita the middle finger for writing such a shitty character and showing him how it's done. It would be easier to pick a random past female character from any Godzilla movie and highlight where Noriko Oishi rises above them, so instead I'll just go through Noriko's characteristics, where she fits in the drama, and where she'll most likely head towards. But first I wanna make the point that the actress who plays Noriko named Minami Hamabe is leading actress gorgeous, especially in Shin Kamen Rider wherein she wears a trench coat. Anyways, in the narrative, Noriko manages to get by in the post-war chaos as her parents told her to survive during the air raids that killed them. We were told that she found a dying mother and her baby Akiko one fateful day, and that woman had Noriko look after her baby before passing away. She and Koichi cross paths and form a connection over looking after Akiko. While Koichi is working sweeping mines out at sea, Noriko gets a job in the Ginza part of Tokyo which has rebuilt since the war ended, making them dual learners. She serves as Koichi's guiding light in his war, helping him find solace and meaning, and giving him the motivation to keep on living and rise above his failure. Despite there being a romance in true Japanese Godzilla movie style, we don't really see any displays of affection other than a couple of embraces, which is fine. The romance between Nick Adams with Kumi Mizuno in 1965's Monster Zero was half-baked anyway. Noriko is described as a strong-willed woman, but her encounter with Godzilla in Ginza utterly breaks her. She was on the train when Godzilla bit down on it and lifted it up in his mouth. She held on for dear life, only to fall into a river and climb to shore. Seeing Godzilla wreck Tokyo leaves her shell-shocked and devastated, and it required Koichi to get her moving. That is the kind of drama we've never seen before in Godzilla movies, and it's done perfectly well here. In the past, there were female characters whose dramas were related to the threat of Godzilla. First example was Emiko tripping herself because she wore slacks and Ogata picking her up during Godzilla's hillside appearance. Even Godzilla 2014 had Elizabeth Olsen run from the male Muto, only to run into a shelter when Godzilla showed up in San Francisco Beta Fight. One female character who this doesn't apply to is Kyoko from Shin Godzilla. She never gets to be in the same scene with Godzilla at all in that movie. She just stands there watching from a distance as unmanned trains, drones, and buildings fall on Godzilla, no human interaction with him at all. Even James Rolfe said it himself in his Godzilla 2014 re-review.
You can still focus on human drama, but have it be more closely related to the threat of Godzilla.
And the fact that he praised Shin Godzilla when it didn't even try to meet that standard is embarrassing. Lastly, historically speaking, there were Japanese civilians that survived the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and they were called the Hibakusha. Not only did they live for a short amount of time, they were discriminated when it came to marriage and work due to public ignorance about the consequences of radiation sickness, with much of the public believing it to be hereditary or contagious. At the end of the film, Noriko seems to have contracted a form of radiation sickness, which means Godzilla's effect on her is going to last for who knows how long. Some fans have gone as far as to speculate she might become a Godzilla-like hybrid in the future akin to Nemesis from the kaiju thriller novels, which is somewhat of a callback to humanoids peeling off of Shin Godzilla's tail at the end, but we'll see. Tachibana only appears at the beginning and end of the movie, yet his role in the story is of utter importance. At the beginning, he suspects Koichi of being a deserter when he finds nothing wrong with his Kamikaze plane. After Godzilla massacres his fellow mechanics, Tachibana collects their corpses and resents Koichi for hesitating. He also got his leg injured during Godzilla's attack, so much later on into the story nears its end, there's a shot of Koichi walking home, and it's just his feet, and Tachibana catches up to him, and we are able to recognize him, because he's not walking normally. At first, he refuses to help because why would he help someone he sees as a coward and a deserter? But then Koichi reasons with him in a way that he understands. He tells him about his war, and completing this mission will put his war to rest, finishing the mission that he deserted, and it would also end Tachibana's own war. This strikes a chord with him. Now if there was one thing Tachibana's character arc needed, it would be seeing everyone joining the fight as volunteers, and not through obligation, and agreeing that the Japanese government didn't really care about the lives of its people, and not giving them a choice to live. I think that would strengthen his decision to fix up the plane and install an ejection feature. But there is enough wiggle room to suggest that he updated the plane to have ejectable seats, because that was up to date at the time. Had he chose not to install an ejection seat when he should have, would have damaged his character. In the end, either way, he gives Koichi a salute before he flies off. This kinda resembles chiastic structure or ring theory in literature. It's incredible. The actor who plays Yoji Akitsu, Kuranosuke Sasaki, has the most charisma out of the entire cast, and dare I say he is 10 times more charismatic than Bryan Cranston. I don't give a fuck what anybody says, he really is. He's that much better. For example,
You're a pussy.
when we first meet Yoji Akitsu, he introduces Koichi to the Shinsei Meru, the boat designated to sweep mines, which he thought would be all high-tech, but it really turned out to be just a wooden tugboat and a piece of shit.
But it's really just a freighter and a piece of shit.
However, even pieces of shit can be iconic and be practical. The boat being wooden makes it immune to magnetic mines, which is a detail Koichi picked up on, and Yoji admired him for picking up on that. As a character, he seems to be a family man, someone who values camaraderie in his tugboat team, calling Shirokid and Kenji Doc, and someone who values Koichi's makeshift family. At the dinner scene, he reprimands Koichi for shrugging off Akiko calling him dad, and tells him that fate has brought him, Noriko, and Akiko together, and he should get used to it, embrace it, make it his own. Yoji is also skeptical of the Japanese government, before and after the war. He knows full well the Japanese government would send its own people to die as well as not tell them vital information like warning the masses of Godzilla's arrival. Now even though he doesn't like taking orders from the Japanese government, he understands the initiative to do it. There's a line in the movie wherein he says someone's gotta do it. This tells me that Yoji is someone who will keep his word, even if he doesn't necessarily want to, so on a certain level, Yoji actually is a very honorable character. Shiro Mizushima is the kid of the Shinsei Meru tugboat team. He comes off as Yoji Akitsu's cabin boy and a useful comrade. Even though he is useful on the Shinsei Meru, he wanted to be useful for the Japanese army during World War II, but he didn't get the chance to do so. When clearing out mines, he wishes that the war was still going on, but Koichi makes him take that back. Makes sense since Koichi saw so many horrors in his service, and knows the pressure of Kamikaze, but Shiro doesn't, which makes him a wide-eyed innocent who doesn't really know what he's talking about. Later on, he wants to make himself useful in the fight against Godzilla, but Yoji and Kenji prevent him, because 1, he's too young to fight, and 2, they want to leave the future to him. Rather compelling. Much later, just when it seems that the plan won't work, they hear Shiro's voice, and see a fleet of tugboats manned by Japanese civilians wanting to help. Lando Calrissian did something like this in Star Wars Episode 9. Something similar also happened in Avengers Endgame, arguably twice in King of the Monsters. It also happened in Lord of the Rings: The Two Towers, and this trope is called the cavalry. Even though it does seem rather lucky that Shiro arrived at the precise moment when those tugboats were needed, it makes a lot of sense character-wise that he would commit to this action. And one can think that he was watching the plan unfold from afar, and when the 2 boats couldn't lift Godzilla up, that's when he gave the order to set out. Overall, Mizushima is a more realized version of Shinkichi from the first Godzilla movie. He obviously doesn't hate Godzilla for bulldozing his house, but both of them are youths, though they would be pretty old Kenis. Some people thought that the doc of the Shinsei Meru, Kenji Noda, was going to be a recycled Serizawa from the first Godzilla movie and create an oxygen destroyer, but that didn't happen. Instead, Kenji is a quirky old guy who seems fun to be around, and he can be sincere in the worst of times. Before we're introduced to Kenji, we are told he used to be an ingenious former weapons engineer for the Japanese Empire, so there was precedence for the ingenious of his plan to bring down Godzilla. His plan is based on an old story of Wadasumi from Japanese mythology, who is basically a water dragon form of the Japanese sea god Ryujin, which is interesting to ponder, because tying those gas containers around Godzilla would be like Wadasumi constricting himself around Godzilla and dragging him down into the depths and letting the pressure kill him. And honestly, this plan makes a lot more sense than Operation Yashiori in Shin Godzilla, because the old story behind that was the 8-headed dragon Orochi getting drunk off of Japanese whiskey, and then the god of storm Susanoo cuts off his heads while he's drunk. Obviously stuff like that doesn't happen in Shin Godzilla, because Shin Godzilla doesn't get drunk, and he doesn't get decapitated. Back to Kenji, he isn't just defined by his ingenious, he's fully aware of the Japanese government's utter disregard for human life, that you have to think he read the script for Shin Godzilla, and pitched it for being much like how the Imperials used Japanese civilians as pawns in a game. He's not only smart in engineering weapons for the Navy once, but also wise in helping Koichi. There's one scene in the film when Noriko is thought to be dead. Kenji lets Koichi in on the private citizen's plan against Godzilla, but he also assures him that his plan, despite potential pitfalls, can work. He does all this while not coming across as condescending like some smart-ass British guy.
By being a smart-ass British guy. And because he dies in the first movie,
Mauler, I think he just called you out.
Oh man.
Some smart ass British guy.
What was this guy's name again? Retarded Republican or something?
Old man bad.
The actress Sakura Ando seems to be a beloved actress, which would explain why she's considered the Japanese Bryan Cranston in -1, in that she was underutilized. I don't know, I don't think she was. If anything, I think she's also a better actress than Bryan Cranston. When we first meet her character Sumiko Ota, she comes off a bit deranged, though that may be a case of empty nest syndrome, because she lost all of her children in the firebombing of Tokyo, Japan. Despite not being a main character, Sumiko does have a semblance of a character. At first she's a bit loopy, after losing everything and everyone, but when Koichi tells her Noriko can't breastfeed the baby, that's when Sumiko puts herself to good use. Not only does she breastfeed Akiko, she also gives them a bag of rice for them to make gruel out of for the baby. Throughout the film, she babysits Akiko, while her adoptive parents are out at work. At the very end of the film, we see Koichi has left a letter to Sumiko telling her to look after Akiko in the event he doesn't come back. Not only the letter, but also the rice bag that she gave them years ago, which makes this payoff all the more sentimental. By the end, Sumiko's character arc comes full circle in some poetic fashion. In the beginning, she scolded Koichi for not fulfilling his kamekozi duties, and in the end, she whacks him for even contemplating kamekozi. Great writing, Yamazaki, great writing. Godzilla -1 can be interpreted as a populist movie in contrast to Shin Godzilla being elitist propaganda, and the character Tatsuo Hotta, despite being introduced by the halfway mark, embodies just that. Tatsuo used to be a commander in the Japanese Navy during World War II, and not only does he unite the common people of Japan against Godzilla, when the Japanese government couldn't, he does so without making it an obligation. That's an aspect of populism that isn't talked about much, the option to opt out of risky situations. Now, truth be told, both Imperial Japan and America did force neutrals to fight the war, whether it be the draft or some religious obligation. A modern example of a populist leader would be Donald J. Trump. Since Ronald Reagan left office, a lot of Americans felt left out of Bill Clinton, George Bush Sr. and Jr., and Barack Obama's elitist America, so they looked up to a businessman who wasn't afraid to speak his mind, so they can know what they can do for their country, and not their country can do for them. Back to Tatsuo, he's a fearless leader when carrying out Operation Wadasumi. When Godzilla stops being raised at 800 meters below sea level, Tatsuo gives the command to raise him up with all they have. It was desperate, but it was better than doing nothing. His best line in the entire movie comes when Mizushima arrives with his armada of tugboats, and it's "Let's catch a Godzilla." Great. In my video discussing why Godzilla -1 will be better than 1954, I stated that Goji was on track to being the best iteration of Godzilla I've ever seen. And I was right.
And man, does it feel good to be right.
Since the movie's release, people have regarded Goji as the most terrifying Godzilla to date, and that's because he is what Shin Godzilla failed to be, expressive. Shin Godzilla had a bland, vanilla, granular, sterile, blank, static face. His eyes didn't even move to obvious stimuli. You watch -1, and you'll see that Goji looks pissed off, because he's been mutated by a nuke. The first Godzilla movie showed Goji was motivated by hunger and revenge, but we only get to see him using his mouth a few times. -1 takes it to the next level. Goji uses his mouth a lot more, and there's a reason. It's because the dude is predatorial. Obviously he doesn't eat at all in the movie, but he's still by definition a predator. Likes cats, would kill things, but not eat them for the thrills and spills of it. During the scene out at sea, Godzilla regenerates his mouth after a mine blows up in it, and it heals up rather quickly. The quickest we've ever seen in both the Godzilla movies and the live-action Attack on Titan movies. The first Godzilla movie teased at the possibility of Godzilla having regenerative abilities by suggesting that he was hit by a nuke, but survived, and that might give mankind a chance to survive an atomic blast if the secret to Godzilla's durability can be unlocked. While that is making lemonade, when life gives you lemons, that's not enough to make Godzilla look like a hero. This idea would later be delved more into in Godzilla 2000 with Regenerator G1. Katagiri's missiles were effective against Godzilla like crap through a goose, but Godzilla was able to heal himself pretty quickly despite pieces of his skin falling off like asphalt. In -1, the Regenerator G1 aspect is taken to the nth degree, almost making Godzilla invulnerable to just about every threat, including the atomic blast of Operation Crossroads itself. His premutated body was burned up by the atomic explosion, and the radioactive material penetrated his skin causing errors in the cells of the epidermis, and even with his regenerative properties, it was impossible to regain his original form. Much like a cancer, his body became gigantic, as if going out of control, and it became a giant that far exceeded his previous appearance. This was the moment when Godzilla was born. I couldn't find any other image of Godzilla's premutated form from the movie, so I made do with an image of the toy on eBay. Anyway, the origin story of Godzilla in -1 is obviously based on the origin of Godzilla in the Heisei timeline, wherein he used to be a dinosaur living on an island in the South Pacific. In Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah, the island is a battlefield for Imperial Japan and the Ally forces, mostly the United States Navy, and Godzillasaurus comes out of his office wanting to know what's going on, only to get pelted by naval projectiles. After stepping on American soldiers, he retreats back into his neck of the woods, but is bleeding really badly. The origin takes a nonsensical turn for the worse when the Futurians teleport Godzillasaurus from his island to what looks like the ocean floor of the Bering Sea. First of all, the film never makes it clear that Godzillasaurus can breathe underwater, unlike the previous movies that didn't mention it, but show that even an irradiated Godzilla can breathe underwater. And second, submerging yourself with deep open wounds in a body water will deplete your body of blood, and you'll die of blood loss rather quickly. Meaning that Godzillasaurus would either drown or bleed to death long before he would be hit by a Soviet nuke, and therefore, he would never mutate into 84 Gojira as we see him in Godzilla 1984. This completely breaks the Heisei timeline. However, Godzilla -1 has no timeline or time-traveling shenanigans. Goji was just a dinosaur living on an island minding his own business till he got nuked, and he mutated. With all the meat and potatoes concerning Godzilla out of the way, here are some superficial aspects. Goji's got brand new dorsal fins that look pretty cool. What's interesting is when Godzilla charges his atomic breath, the dorsal fins pop out, and they pop back in before firing, much like pistons, almost like Godzilla is a certain atomic railgun. As for the atomic breath itself, it literally creates nuclear explosions. This happens about 3 times in the movie. And it's even more consistent than in the first Godzilla movie, wherein the first time it's used is like a flamethrower to melt steel electrical towers like hot wax, but then it's used to create explosions. Even GMK was more consistent with its atomic breath creating explosions. By and large now, everyone has noticed that Godzilla is all CGI, but some have even noticed that both the pre-mutated and mutated forms of Godzilla appear to be reminiscent of American iterations. The pre-mutated form resembles TriStar's Godzilla in how horizontally postured he is, like the T-Rex in Jurassic Park, except Godzilla doesn't have Dictros's preposterous chin like Zilla does. Though he does resemble more the design Ricardo Delgado sculpted for the scrapped American 1994 Godzilla film. The mutated form does resemble the classical upright traditional Godzilla we're used to seeing, but he also leans forward and looks like a monster ready to fight, just like legendary's Godzilla. His screen time throughout the movie can be seen as visual references to scenes in the MonsterVerse movies, like Godzilla taking the Takao, like he did Kong's fleet of ships in GVK, and his charred yet triumphant roar at the end references Godzilla getting his ass beat by the Mutus in 2014. So what does this all mean? Why does it seem that Yamazaki has poached these visual cues from the American Godzilla movies, when the whole point of -1 is to return Godzilla to his original Japanese roots, quote unquote? The answer may be that he's on good terms with the American directors, like Gareth Edwards, who saw -1 before everyone else did, and greatly admired Yamazaki's work. or more shrewdly to stick it to the Toho Purists. But that'll be its own slide further down the line. Being a period piece, there were things from that time period shown, and things that were ignored. Now yes, there were incidents of sexual violence in post-war Japan committed by GIs, and maybe that is what this Titanic moron wanted -1 to be about.
The absence of American GIs actually harkens back to the films of Japan from the 1940s and the occupation period. So films that commented on the sorry state of post-war Japan would have to reference the US military by means of omission. But in Godzilla -1, a film that is coming out closer and closer to a century since the defeat of Japan in World War II, this omission just makes the setting feel incomplete.
Obviously they were ignored, because it wasn't the focus of the story. You can't show everything. It can't be about everything. But there's one thing every fictional story operates by, even if it's based on history. Internal consistency will always be important. Internal consistency does not care about historical accuracy. What matters is that it is real within the story, as long as the story establishes how the world operates, who is in charge, and that changes to the world are supported by events caused by choices characters make, based on their interest. Japan was occupied by the United States with Douglas MacArthur in charge as per history, but in the world of -1, they seem non-present, which would make one believe they were more laissez-faire, or hands-off. And on top of that, there's also the Soviet Union mentioned. Makes perfect sense. Russia was humiliated by Imperial Japanese forces decades prior, so during World War II, Stalin would have his revenge by blitzing through Manchurian territory. This resulted in the Soviet Union having a presence looming over Japan which should not be underestimated. If -1 took place in post-World War II Germany, then the film would have had to include the Soviet occupation, because the Soviets were utter brutes. They shot anyone trying to climb over their concrete wall in the middle of Berlin. But enough about that. There's one tidbit that Koichi mentions, and it's American condensed milk, which is fine. As for the historically accurate demilitarization of Japan, there's Koichi and his Shinsei crew shooting mines. But later on in the film, MacArthur would reverse the demilitarization, so that Japan can defend itself from Godzilla. If not, then he would be a negligent moron and that would damage his off-screen character. From a movie standpoint, there is barely any Godzilla lore anyway, but it is incredibly simple yet cool to understand. Whenever Godzilla approaches, dead fish rise to the survive, so we know what that means. From a metatextual perspective though, Odo Island has been repurposed from the original Godzilla movie. While the Americans and Soviets are doing their Cold War nonsense, the Imperial Japanese government has been dismantled, but the Japanese people themselves who've been propagandized by state Shintoism are left to fend for themselves in the face of Godzilla. As harsh as it may be, this is logical, since imperial or not, the Japanese government never really cared about its human citizens. The film is a rejection of the cult of death of fascism, especially Imperial Japan's state Shinto fascism. This film tells both its characters and the audience that humans deserve to live, and they do not have to die for the state. And that is why Americans are liking -1 far more than they liked Shin Godzilla. So well done Yamazaki. Well done. I have unfortunately seen stories that present characters who regress, break from their histories, learn themselves out of scumbag behavior, that holier-than-thou characters commit to, woefully lacking any definition, that they can be potentially anything as opposed to actually something, and I've seen many people latch onto the story's theme, because talking about story component that are incompatible with the theme can only damage the idea at hand. The presence or adherence to a theme cannot simply wash away any criticism, especially that which is incongruent with a theme in question. The anime trilogy is prime example of that. Godzilla -1 does not have to hide behind its themes and ideas. It's supported by characters behaving consistently as opposed to being used like puppets for someone else's ideas at the time. The most common discussions I could find on -1's themes are focused more on the preservation of human life, which is a strong theme. Nobody can deny that. Given the historical significance, as stated several times, the Japanese government had no respect of humanity, no shame for their failure to protect its citizens during the war and after from the threat of Godzilla, as well as the pressuring young men into suicide missions during the war and throwing themselves off of cliffs as opposed to dying at the hands of incoming American forces. The film presents preserving life as voluntary action as opposed to an obligation. And because it's a choice, the people involved in Operation Wadasumi appear more than happy than they did during the war. Since death by suicide was not guaranteed in the mission, this laid out what Kenji described as the truest of sacrifices. If not a fight to the death, then it was a fight for future lives. There is another strong theme in the film about family, particularly making them out of displaced persons. The film shows that family doesn't have to be blood. It's the people you love, the people you choose. Together they fight, together they lose, and perhaps it's together that they are able to come back. The MonsterVerse Godzilla films also have the theme of family, make of it what you will, though the most broken family theme I've seen thus far has to be in Disney Star Wars. The Force Awakens had us think that Rey's parents don't matter, and that she can find people who become influential to her, crafting her character instead of looking back. Only that changed in The Last Jedi. It's not that it's not important, it's that it's nobody that would matter, which doesn't actually make sense in universe, but it does make sense in a meta-commentary sort of way. Only that changed again in Rise of the Skywalker, which tells us, no, it's not that it's nobody, and it's not that it doesn't matter, it's that it's somebody, but it's somebody that doesn't define her, somebody that doesn't matter. Unfortunately, while the value of life resonates with both Japanese and American audiences, the Japanese aren't exactly on board with starting families. If you can look at these charts, the number of Japanese households have increased, but there's a decline in households with children in them. And Japan's population has been on a steady decline since the mid-1970s. It just might be a sign of the otaku power structure's grip on the Japanese population. They can't stand looking at other humans. That might explain why they don't like American films with families in them. Unless people are pretending to be retarded, I don't see how anyone can say -1 doesn't have any political subtext. It doesn't hit you over the head with an anti-nuclear agenda like the original Gojira, nor does it say you must conform to be a cog in the machine, when the old guard are incompetent and gay, like in Shin Godzilla. Am I right, Kyodaiki no? Godzilla -1 can be interpreted as a populist film as by definition, its focus is on the people's plight and struggles, while they are ignored by the government. Populism itself cannot be positioned on the left-right political spectrum, and both right and left-wing populisms exist, though -1 appears to be populist in general. It shows that private citizens manage to get by on their own without government intervention, while also showing that said private citizens have plenty of hope for a brighter future. That last part about hope is also present in Godzilla Raids Again, and the original Gojira has nothing of the sort. When watching both the original and its Showa sequel, it made me realize that the people that think the original Godzilla is the best movie tend to be doomer people. The world sucks, I get it, but there's plenty of good things in it that bloom and are worth living to see. And I just love that -1 not only improves upon the original movie, but also incorporates Raids Again's hope in a new and detailed way. Director, writer, and visual effects director, Takashi Yamazaki, the man himself, should be fucking proud of himself. The man's prowess is as obvious as his filmography. His best work, outside of Godzilla -1, has to be the Always Sunset on 3rd Street trilogy, based on the manga by Reiwa Saigon. Now the budget for -1 has been reported to be less than $15 million, which goes to show that you don't need a big budget to tell a good story. Since Japanese CGI isn't as refined as Western CGI, it requires more fine-tuning to get right. Yamazaki knew this, so he was very lenient with his visual effects team. I do wish Western filmmakers adopted this kind of leniency, but Hollywood is always slow to change, unfortunately. While Yamazaki is lenient with his visual effects team, he has shown to not take any bullshit from critics on both sides of the Pacific Ocean. We've already gone through some of Godzilla Minus One's retarded detractors, but his 2013 film The Eternal Zero was criticized for nationalistic and sympathetic depiction of the kamikaze pilots. Which is the point of the film. War sucks for both sides, not just for the winning or losing side. Saving Private Ryan was grotesque, but no one raised a fit, since Americans won the war in Europe anyways. So when The Eternal Zero came under scrutiny by these retards, the director came out and said the film depicts the war as a complete tragedy, so how can you say it glorifies war? I really don't get it. Neither do I. If anything, where were these critics in 2006 when the novel which the film is based on by Naoki Hyakita was published? Don't know, don't care. I mentioned this once as one of my 4 reasons Minus One will surpass the original Gojira, and it bears repeating. If you were to look at Yamazaki's track record up to this point, you'll see that Godzilla Minus One is the culmination of the director's vision, since Always Sunset on 3rd Street 2 back in 2007. Yamazaki bided his time for the technology to evolve considerably, and once it did for 2014 and Shin, that's when he decided to show what he can do with Godzilla the ride at Bayonne theme park. And now we have Godzilla Minus One, and an insane amount of work has been into it with so much care, that it's unbelievable we are in a timeline that we got to see the perfection of a fully CGI Godzilla. Eat that, you Toho Purists. Before Minus One was released to the public, the previous directors of past Godzilla movies got to see the film in its completion. And those directors came out with high praises as well. Gareth Edwards in particular came out and said there were a lot of things that I felt were very new for Godzilla, and I felt jealous the whole time I was watching the movie. This is what a Godzilla movie should be. Godzilla Minus One must be mentioned as a candidate for the best Godzilla movie of all time. And I actually agree with the chubby Brit on this. And some have taken his jealous comment to mean that his film wasn't the fullest it could be, since parts of it were redacted quote unquote, otherwise the US military complex would have pulled the plug on the project. If anything, the US military complex should have at least redacted the gayness. Interestingly enough, Hideaki Anno saw Minus One too, and stated it was well made. It brings together all the technical capabilities we have cultivated up to now, and it is no exaggeration to say that it is the culmination of Mr. Yamazaki's work. He also said warships are lukewarm. Which, I think he meant to say cool. Right now, Yamazaki has the idea of a Minus One sequel floating in his head. If Toho was smart and really wanted to get the Japanese side of the Godzilla franchise back on its feet, then I say go for it. They should stick with him. They should ditch the assembly line approach of hiring directors and their one-offs. Yamazaki has proven himself to be Eiichiro Honda's true and rightful heir. The Godzilla franchise is better off in his hands. If Toho wants to proceed with their so-called World of Godzilla thing, then Minus One is the film to begin it with. Period. As for the sequel itself, I'd like to see Rodan and Ghidorah as they were in the ride too. Perhaps the story can carry where Minus One left off, and be a spiritual remake of Monster Zero. Wouldn't that be cool? I'm seeing people praising Godzilla Minus One, while putting down the MonsterVerse Godzilla films for not giving them the emotional experience they wanted, which Minus One gave them. When really it's a conflation of feeling compelling emotions with character writing quality, which are two separate things. While I've said plenty of things about the MonsterVerse movies in the past, I've come to the realization that they are low-hanging fruit. That is why I've been far more critical with Toho than I've been with Legendary. According to Toho Purist dogma, only true and authentic Godzilla content comes from Japan, therefore, Toho should be held to a higher standard. But before Minus One, Toho made 4 shitty fucking movies, and 1 shitty fucking anime series, and the worst part, these Toho purists let them get away with it when all they've done was sit on their asses, and said this feels better, oh I feel like this is right, you know what, my opinions are the best opinions. So now, Takashi Yamazaki not only created a film with great writing, and used ideas from all past Godzilla films, be they Toho, Legendary, or TriStar, but in so doing, has subtly given the Toho purists the ultimate fuck you for being complacent. I've seen Matt Burkett from Monstrosities give his 2 cents about not liking -1 for retarded reasons like Patrick Willems did with Star Wars, but he knows deep down inside that the Godzilla IP is no longer Toho pure. Eventually, people will catch on to what -1's true message is, and their tears will be glorious, but honestly, I wouldn't drink their tears, since drinking tears is disgusting. Sigh. Now with that refutation out of the way, let's talk about the soundtrack. -1's music is composed by Naoki Sato, who works with Yamazaki a lot. He composed all 3 Always Sunset on 3rd Street movies. For -1, Naoki Sato provided a list of great music. Resolution being my personal favorite, since it was used when Koichi took flight against Godzilla. Divine sounds rather divine, and it was used for the Countdown teaser trailer. Before I end this video, these are the trivial things about the film. Things that have no relevance to the plot in any way, things that shouldn't really be considered plot holes, but more so nitpicks you would find on a Wikipedia article, if Wikipedia's editors would allow it. First, I would have been okay if Naoki Sato composed all original music, but I think Toho insisted that he recomposed Akira Ifukube's music for the Showa Godzilla movies. Not only that, Gojira does have new sound effects, but his main raw set is a classic 1950s Godzilla sound design, only revamped. Why all this? Well, I think Toho has been doing what Disney has done with Star Wars since 2015. When the world is changing so fast, it makes us yearn for the old ways, when life seemed simpler. But it doesn't mean those old ideas are good for us now. We have to face one reality as a country. Shin Godzilla sucked, and wasn't as good as we thought it was. It may seem fine to go back and repurpose the old, but we end up with no intellectual substance. That's when you get member berries. Though I'm making it sound like J.J. Abrams is responsible for the entire Reiwa era. Anyways, there are moments where the CGI looks unpolished. This shot from the trailer shows a CGI-regarded Godzilla's composite looks unfinished, but hey, writing is more important than CGI, so who cares? And as you can tell, I actually clocked Godzilla's screen time in this film, pre-mutated and mutated, and counted how many times he's on screen, and then it cuts away to the humans, pre-mutated and mutated. He's on screen for 12 minutes 5 seconds out of a 2-hour movie, which is 10% of the film, and it cuts away from him 93 times. Overall, typical for Godzilla films in general. So yeah, the autistic just here for Godzilla crowd can deal with all that. Penultimately, I'm aware of the so-called Barbenheimer cultural phenomenon meme thing. While do understand people hyping up to counter-programmed films and making memes out of it, it was overall fucking stupid. I was unfortunate to watch Barbie in the theater and it sucked. Luckily the trailer to Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes played before it, so it was worth sitting through all that mind-numbing schlock. I don't care if it was a psyop, or third-wave feminist propaganda, or accidentally based, it was just terrible. In my honest opinion, Oppenheimer is best viewed before watching Godzilla -1. Oppenheimer was literally called the father of the atomic bomb, which scared Japan into surrendering and reduced it to zero, so logically Godzilla would show up to bring Japan down to the negative. Makes a lot more sense than Barbenheimer, and it would make for a better double feature experience. What I've told you is objectively true. Godzilla -1 is objectively superior to all past Godzilla movies in every single way. This is now my new favorite Godzilla film for one simple reason, because it gave Toho purism a much needed serious kick in the nuts, and this movie got the job done. Anyways, I'm done. Good night and I'm signing out.